Hi folks, and welcome to Life Sciences. We're looking at population ecology today, and before we start, you got to remember that population ecology is in paper 2, and in this topic we can look at data response questions. There's a whole lot of terminology that we need to know, and we must be able to interact with different case studies. So I think it's important that we very quickly look at what population dynamics is, or population ecology is, and then we attempt some of the questions. Today we've prepared some questions for you so that we can look at them, mainly from last year's final exam papers, lots of case studies, and I think that's the way to prepare. At this time of your preparation for your grade 12 exams, you should be working with as many question papers as possible. You should be referring to various sources and trying to consolidate what you've learned through the year. So let's look at what we could look at in population ecology. When we look at population ecology, there's a whole lots of terminology in terms of the relationship between organisms. We look at social organization, breeding hierarchies, division of labor. We also look at how the different relationships exist between organisms. So often we get these questions coming in your terminology or multiple choice, and we tend to rush through these questions assuming that's going to be easy. But we must be warned that the options in often the multiple choice are very similar, and hence we need to read very carefully and eliminate the obvious and then work with the options that are most correct. So let's look at some of the questions that I've prepared for you today. So this question has been adapted from the November 2011 examination paper, and this question is on a graph, and let's read through the questions very quickly. So questions 1.1 and 1.2 are based on the graph below. Study the graph and answer the questions that follow. Let's look at the graph. And guys, whenever you have a graph, look at the graph and try and understand the graph before you attempt the questions, because if you don't understand the graph, it's going to be quite difficult for you to interpret the information when you need to apply the understanding into a graph. So the first thing I will do is look at the graph. I will look at the x-axis, look at the y-axis, I will look at the heading for the graph to try and establish what is the graph illustrating. So let's look at this. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the heading. So the heading for this graph is the relationship between populations of jackals and rabbits over a period of time. So obviously it's showing us how these two organisms interact over a period of time. On the x-axis, the independent variable, we see year, and year is a unit of time, so we see time on the x-axis, and we see population size on the y-axis, and that we see increasing in units of 100. Okay, and here on the x-axis we see time in units of 10-year intervals. Right, the two graphs that are illustrated are a graph showing jackal population, so I'm going to use green to highlight that, and we see the rabbit population. I'm going to use yellow to highlight and differentiate that. And that's essentially what you guys should do. Often you find that your papers are printed in black and white, and I'd encourage you to use a highlighter, use a different colored pen so that you make that graph look more presentable, so that you can clearly see trends in that, and so it enhances your understanding of that graph. We see in this example jackals and rabbits, and from our understanding of population ecology, you'd remember that this is a relationship between a prey and a predator, and often we'd see that in nature you'll often find close relationships between prey and predator in any ecosystem. So I'm definitely sure that the questions are going to be around prey-predator relationships in this, but we've got to understand and look at the graph and understand the relationship between these two before we attempt to solve this question. So if we look at the relationship between the jackals and rabbits in this graph, we can clearly see that the number of the jackals, obviously the jackals would be the predator. So I'm going to very quickly label the jackals as the predator and the rabbits as the prey. Often I have some of my learners asking me, but sir, how could you differentiate between rabbits and jackals, not having given any labels for this? So simply by what I mean, what would happen if that graph was not labeled rabbits and jackals, but you were asked to label the graph, and which would be the predator and which would be the prey? And often in any ecosystem, naturally you will find that the prey population, which are obviously small organisms, would be much larger as compared to the predators, which are normally the bigger organisms, the secondary consumers, or even the tertiary consumers. So a giveaway for understanding this graph would be to look at this population size, and that often would indicate to us the number or the type of organism, and we would expect to find more rabbits in this case than in jackals. Okay, so let's see. So we can clearly see in the rabbit population, we see there are much more rabbits as compared to the jackals, and the jackals, obviously their numbers are much fewer. When we look at this relationship, and if I were to explain this relationship, we will find that as the rabbit population increases, the jackal population increases up to a point where any further increase in the jackal population causes some decrease in the prey population. So now that we've understood this graph, let's look at the first question. This is obviously a multiple choice question, and often we tend to rush through this, but guys, I appeal to you to read through these questions carefully and eliminate the options that are definitely not correct, and then zero in on the options that are most correct. So let's look at 1.1. Which interaction in a community is illustrated by the graph? So we need to identify the interaction illustrated by the graph above. So is it parasitism? No, because we see this relationship between two organisms where one depends on the other, and it wouldn't be a parasitic relationship. Is it predation? And yes, it would be predation, as we see that the jackal is preying on a smaller prey, which is the rabbit. It's definitely not division of labor, and not an example of commensalism. Commensalism again is an example where one organism benefits and the other is neither harmed nor benefits. So this is clearly not an example of a commensalic relationship. Let's move on to the next question. What effect does a decrease in the number of jackals have on the rabbit population? So we've got to go back to the graph and interpret the information. The question again, I'll repeat, is what effect does a decrease in the number of jackals have on the rabbit population? Okay, so let's see. So when we look at this aspect, this part of the graph, guys, I'm going to use a different color, where the jackal population decreases. And so we see during these phases the jackal population decreasing. The question is, what happens to the rabbit population when this relationship exists? You'll find that the rabbit populations increase, and here you see a similar trend. So during a decrease in the jackal population, the rabbit populations would increase. Let's see which option is most correct. A, the rabbit population decreases. That's not correct. B, the rabbit population is eliminated from the habitat after a long period of time. We don't have enough evidence for that to make that conclusion. C, the rabbit population increases, and we clearly saw that from the trends in the graph. We saw that the rabbit population here increases when the jackal population decreases. The most correct answer would be C, but nevertheless, let's read D and see why that is not correct. Both the rabbit populations and the jackal populations are eliminated from the habitat, and that's not true, as we clearly see from the graph that both of these coexist, where the numbers of each one influences the other. Let's move on to the next question, guys. This is a question that's adapted from a 2011 November exam. Again, it's in paper 2, and again we're looking at a few more multiple choice questions based on this. We've got to study the age gender pyramid shown below for a developing country. Okay, and before we look at this question, we often find gender pyramids or age gender pyramids showing us the different periods in terms of the population, in terms of their growth, from birth all the way up to when the population has reached the older individuals. In that we see a pre-reproductive age in terms of the numbers of individuals that are capable of reproducing as they move into the next bracket, and we see a reproductive age, which would be the age that contributes, or the segment of the population that contributes to the population increasing. And then we see the post-reproductive age, and these would be individuals that have gone through the reproductive age and now age in that population. So very quickly, when I looked at this question, I noticed that this graph was very unusual for the fact that we've got clear indications of the numbers on the female side, but when I looked at the male side, I could not ascertain in terms of the number in millions along for the males. So what I suggest is that you often could get an example of a graph like this, and then in an exam, what happens? Do we stress? Do we say, oh, what to do now? And I think it's very important for us to look at a question, to analyze the question, and to read the options. And I can guarantee you that if there is a problem with the question, that will be sorted out during the marking session. But it's very important that you attempt the question. If you leave that question out, the examiner, when marking your paper, will not know whether you attempted the question because you didn't know the answer or because you didn't understand the question. And I would suggest that you attempt every question, whether the question is complete, incomplete, or you don't understand. The important thing is to write an answer down. If there's no answer, unfortunately, you cannot get a mark. But if there's an answer, there's a possibility that you could get a mark if your answer is correct. So let's look at this question. So I said that there could have been a problem with the graph, but what do we tend to normally expect? We tend to expect that the graph would have looked something like this, guys. Okay, having quite similar, a mirror image on the side with probably something like that on the younger reproductive, pre-reproductive age. So let's look at some of these questions. Okay, so which one of the following can be correctly deduced from the age-gender pyramid? Okay, so the age-gender pyramid firstly shows you the age, and obviously it shows us gender of a population in a specific country. And that obviously is represented in millions along the x-axis. So what can we deduce from this? A, an even spread of numbers at each age group. And if we look up, do we see an even spread of numbers? And unfortunately, that is not indicative of this graph. It's not even. So that will definitely be not correct. B, the population has a high number of people at the reproductive age compared to the pre-reproductive age and post-reproductive age. Now, the terms reproductive age, guys, reproductive age, pre-reproductive age, and post-reproductive ages. Now, when we look at any population, there is always an age group that is contributing to the growth of that population by producing young offspring. The post-reproductive age would be individuals in that population that are out of that bracket where they're capable of reproducing and producing young ones. The pre-reproductive age would be those individuals in their adolescence or growing up that will mature and then be able to reproduce and contribute to that population. So when we look at this graph, guys, if we look at this graph and we look at the reproductive age, if it is a human population, we know that humans are, this would be their reproductive ages. So this would be the reproductive ages. This group would be the pre-reproductive. (41 to 50) onwards would be the post-reproductive ages. So these would be the individuals that contribute to the growth of that population. Let's look at the question. Okay, so we said that it could be possibly BB, but we're not too sure. Let's read C. There are more males and females in each age group. And from this graph, guys, as I said, we would, from this year, it would be very hard to say, but if we had a graph that imaged the female side on the male side, it would be very difficult, and we would need to then compare the males and female side. So I would say that we would not be able to assume that based on this graph. And D, the birth rate and death rate are about the same. The birth rate, guys, would refer to would be these individuals in a population. So I'm just going to change my pen for you. So that would be the birth rate. Okay, and the death rate would be that. And unfortunately, if we look at the number of people, that the death rate would be less than 1 million as compared to the birth rate being more than 2.2. So that is an uneven comparison. So that would not be correct. So that would not be correct. And I would agree with this answer as being the most correct answer. Let's move on to the next question. What is the main characteristic of an age pyramid for a developing country? Guys, remember that developing countries are countries that are growing, that are rich in resources, and it would indicate that there are lots of young that are growing up, and that the availability of resources would ensure that the birth rate is higher than the death rate. And when we look at this graph, we can see that the birth rate is significantly higher than the death rate, and that would be indicative of a developing country. So let's look at the options and eliminate the ones that are not true. So A, the number of newborn are high. That's correct. there are more young people than old people. That's correct. There are more females than males in an age group. That's not correct. The life expectancy of the population is high. Okay, so in a developing country, guys, we would expect the life expectancy of the population to be high, which simply means that if we look at this graph, guys, we clearly see that the life expectancy of individuals as we get to 81 and 90 is much higher as compared to a population where the number of individuals that survive, the post-reproductive age decreases drastically. And hence the answer for this would be the answer D. Okay, so we're going to move on to some more questions in this section that deal with lots of terminology. And as I stressed during the introduction, that we deal with lots of questions that are terminology based, and hence you need to have a thorough understanding of your terminology. And the best way to do that, guys, is to have a terminology list that you've written down and that you keep when you're studying, and you refer to that during your studies so that you know the terminology, and that terminology can be applied by you in any of the questions. So let's look at the next question. This question has been adapted from the November 2011 paper 2. Let's read through the question. Indicate whether each of the statements in both columns 1 applies to A only, B only, both A and B, or none. It's very important, guys, for us to answer the question according to what the descriptions has been given. So you've got to say it's A only, B only, A and B, or none. And hence that's exactly what the examiner wants. Please do not rewrite the answers. You're going to waste your time, and you've got to be conscious about the time. As much as these are simpler questions, you've got to run through them and spend the amount of time that is sufficient so that you understand and answer the questions correctly. So read the questions very carefully before attempting to answer them. Let's look at the first column. Here we've got a description, a relationship between different species in which both species benefit. Okay, now we would see this interaction normally where organisms interact with each other, either they benefit from each other or they're harmed or neither benefit. And we refer to these as interactions between them, symbiosis relationships. So we have parasitism, we have mutualism, and we have commensalism. A parasite is one that lives off a host, and obviously in that relationship the parasite benefits and the host is harmed. When we look at a mutual relationship, and that's obviously a mutual, you call a friend a mutual friend because both of you benefit from that relationship. And hence, in nature, a mutual relationship would be a relationship in which both the organisms benefit from coexisting with each other. And sometimes we have a commensalistic relationship or commensalism, and in this relationship you find that both the organisms live together, one benefits from the other while the other neither is harmed nor benefits from having that partner around. So let's see which is the most obvious answer for this. So a relationship in which between different species in which both species benefit would be a mutualistic relationship, and the answer for this would be B only. So you are expected to write B only. Let's look at the next question. An estimation of the amount of the Earth's resources a human population or person or activity consumes in a year. And guys, we've got to look at this. And this is obviously, this question refers to the amount of resources that individuals, populations, or even communities will utilize. And this is used to ascertain the impact that population, community, or individual will have on the environment. So let's look at the options that are given. Okay, A is ecological footprint, and B is simple sampling. Now, if we look at B, simple sampling, this is a technique used to determine population size, and unfortunately it doesn't even relate to the statement that is made in column 1. So we can easily eliminate simple sample size, and that would be the wrong answer. When we look at ecological footprint, guys, now ecological footprint would be the description and definition for ecological footprint would be the impact that an individual, population, or society has on the environment and its resources available to them. So the correct answer for 2.2 would be A only. So we would write down A only in the answer booklet. Let's look at question 2.3. Question 2.3. social organization strategy that enhances survival. And here we've got two options: dominant breeding pairs and division of labor. Before I attempt to answer this question, I must explain to you in terms of what social organization strategies are. Now, this refers to how communities, how populations exist and establish themselves in terms of so that they live sustainably. Now, the answer there, dominant breeding pair. Now, a classical example of that would be wild dogs. Wild dogs have an alpha male and an alpha female. These are the dominant breeding pairs. Why is that important to them? Very important because, firstly, the stronger male and female are allowed to reproduce. This simply means that the stronger genes are passed on to the offspring and they produce pups that are stronger, and hence they pass on characteristics, the stronger characteristics, the more favorable characteristics to the next generation. That is very important in terms of the genetic diversity of that population. We also see wild dogs hunting together as packs. That is another method of social organization where they're more successful hunting together as a pack. We see other examples in terms of division of labor. Division of labor would be in societies where we find there are designated individuals that carry out specific functions. If we look at bees, for example, we find we've got a queen bee that lays the eggs. We've got the workers, we've got the soldiers that defend the hive, we've got the workers that go out and collect the nectar. We also see this in termites. Termites have a definite organization of hierarchy where you've got females, you've got soldiers, you've got workers that go out, collect the food and bring that back. The female will lay the eggs and you've got the males that fertilize those eggs as well. So we see, why is it important that we study this? We study this so that we understand how organizations how organisms live in an organization so that their survival chances increase, their workload decreases, and they become sustainable as a population for the future. Some of the other examples of social organizations would be termites, bees. We can look at wildebeest that do herding. The younger ones, the more vulnerable individuals are towards the center of the herd. The stronger, more dominant males and females on the outside, and hence they protect the younger from the attack from the predators. So these organizations enhance the survival of that population. So let's look at question 2.3 again and see what is the correct answer. So which of these enhance survival? As I said, dominant breeding pairs, yes, as these will pass on stronger characteristics to the offspring, and the division of labor simply means that you have fewer individuals doing the individuals carry out specific functions, and these functions ensure that the division of workload is distributed so that that population survives optimally. If you look at the meerkat population, you often find that there's always a centenary that is perched, and he will look out and see for possible danger. And here we have the division of labor. While he stands and chooses to watch out, you find that the others feed and they forage. And he will give out a little scream and to warn the rest, and then they get into their holes. And this will constantly, this kind of behavior will constantly change between different centenaries in that population, and the idea is to enhance their chances of survival. So the answer here would be both A and B would be correct. Guys, we've looked at some of the terminologies during this first session. It's important, as I stressed, how that the terminology could be applied during your data response questions, during your matching, true and false statements, even your true and false. And I think it's very important for us to be able to know your terminology well, as this section deals a lot with terminology and applying those terminology in data response questions or in your contextuals. So we're going to go for a short break, and we're going to get back and we're going to look at more topics in population ecology. Welcome back, guys. We're going to continue with population ecology. During this segment, we're going to look at some mark and recapture methods, and we're going to also look at some of the population growth curves, so questions around that. So let's look at the first question in this segment. So this question has been adapted again from a 2011 paper. Again, it's in paper 2, guys. Very important for us to remember which paper we're dealing with. Right, so a group of grade 12 learners wanted to use the mark recapture technique to determine the population size of a type of fish called Tilapia spumoni in a large dam. Their results are shown in the table below. This was caught in October 20. They marked and released the first sample, which were 15 fish. In November 2010, a year later, they caught the second sample, and they caught 150 fish in the second sample, and of which 10 of them were marked. So, the first question: list 4 steps that should be considered when planning to determine the population size using this investigation. So we've got to mention 4 steps that should be taken when planning to determine the population size in this investigation. Now guys, before we continue, now tilapia are fish that live in a dam, and to determine the population size, we've got to get a technique that is most correct. Unfortunately, we'll not be able to physically count every individual, and hence we've got to use an indirect method. Now just to very quickly go back, there are 2 types of methods: the direct method and the indirect method. The direct method would be used to sample larger organisms that are slower moving or do not move, so we could do that with maybe elephants in the Kruger National Park. Or we could determine the population of snails that move very slow. So organisms that move slow or very large, or the human population, we would do a direct count because we physically can count every individual in the population if we can see them. However, we cannot do that with organisms that move fast, that are extremely small, or live in habitats that are not easily accessible. So we're not going to be able to count every rat or every fish in a dam. And hence we need to have a technique which is an indirect method. And these methods, there are several types of methods that we know about. One of the method is the Peterson's mark recapture method. The second is the quadrat sampling, and the third is the transects. But let's look at this question. This question deals with the mark recapture, where a population was caught, it was tagged, it was then released, and after a period of time a second sample was caught, and that was counted for, and we looked at how many were tagged in the second sample. That information has been presented in a table, and we would need to use that information to answer the next question. So the question that we have 3.1.1 deals with what are the precautions that need to be taken in terms of to ensure that this investigation is carried out correctly. So some of the precautions that we need to take, guys, is that firstly, if you're planning to do sampling techniques, you must get permission. You cannot simply go out into an area and start collecting. So you got to get permission from the relevant authorities in terms of whether you should have access to conducting a sample there. And it's very important also, second, is that you should train individuals to identify the correct fish, because you're going to have several different species of fish in there, and hence you need to have individuals trained to identify the correct fish. Okay. Other precautions: you should decide on a correct time. Decide on a time. The markings should not affect the behavior or movement of the fish. Okay, which simply means that they should be able to integrate with the rest of the population very well. Okay, you should decide before you start. Decide how you will present your information. You present your information, and that's very important for you to be able to present that information. Okay. Other things that you need to look as, you need to determine the correct method. Determine the best method. And as I said, the best method would be the mark recapture method. Unfortunately, we would not be able to count every fish physically, and hence you cannot use the direct method. So you would need to give 4 steps. And guys, remember that when the examiner says clearly first, in this case to the 4 stages, 4 steps, in this case he or she would only mark the 4 steps, the 4 points that you make, and hence if you write 6, you've actually wasted your time. So if you decided that your last 2 are the best, make sure that you put those on the top of your list and write those first, because the examiner will only mark the first 4 points. Let's move on to the next question. Okay, so use the formula below to estimate the population size of Tilapia spumoni in the dam. Now, this is the Peterson index formula, and guys, that formula has been given to you. You simply need to now substitute the values into this equation and work that out. And you've got to show all your working for 3 marks. And guys, remember that in the exam, you've got to show your working. The examiner in this case will be allocating marks for the process or the method in which you worked out your results. Sometimes during the exam you stressed, you rushed through, you may have substituted the values correctly, but in your final answer you got that wrong. If you've not showed any working, you're not going to get those marks. So in this case, if you've done the working correctly and you've made a mistake during your final calculation, you would get at least the first 2 marks. But if you've not shown the working and you've written an answer that's totally wrong, you would get none of the marks. So it's very important that you clearly show how you worked and your method in terms of how you got to the answer. Let's very quickly do this. So we're simply substituting the values into this formula. That's P times F. P is equal to F times S upon M. And here F is the number of fish caught in the first sample, and if we go back, the number of fish caught in the first sample were 15, so we put that, and that is equal to 15. S would be the number caught in the second sample, and that was, I'm going to write that down here, and the number marked in the second sample were 15. So when they caught the second sample, they found that there were only 15. Sorry, let me go back there. Update wasn't 15, it was 10, guys. It was only 10 that had. So it's 15 times 150 divided by 10. And if we were to very quickly work this out, and you're allowed to use your calculators in an exam, make sure you do. Okay, although it might seem as simple as possible, but make sure you work through and check your answer. So the mark allocations for this would be, you'd get a mark for that, you're going to get a mark for the correct substitution, and hence you would have got 1 mark for the final answer and 2 marks for the working. And as I stress, it's important to show the working, or else you will not get the mark for the method in which you got to the answer. Let's move on to the next question. So during the next few questions, we're going to look at the growth forms or the growth curves that we see in population ecology. And remember that there are 2 types of growth curves, an S-shaped growth curve and a J-shaped or a geometric growth curve. Let's look at this question and identify the type of growth curve that we see in this question. Study the graph below showing the growth of a population over a period of time. This graph shows us a population over a period of time on the x-axis, time on the y-axis, the population size, and we see 3 different stages marked A, B, and C. Let's go to the first question. Identify the growth form indicated by the graph above. And guys, if we look at this here, this is sort of an S-shaped curve, and hence we can call this the S-shaped. You would be marked correct for S-shaped, or some of us could have said it's the logistic growth curve, and you would get your marks for that. You could even say it's a sigmoid growth curve. Okay, let's look at the next question. Identify the phases labeled A, B, and C. A, B, and C. When we look at that graph, guys, we see that A is the phase where the population growth is very slow, and we call A the lag phase, and that is when the population growth is pretty slow. B would be, we see an accelerated growth phase, or the population increasing rapidly. Okay, and we can call B the accelerated growth phase. When we look at C, guys, here we see during C the population becomes more or less stable, and we say that is the stationary or equilibrium phase, where the population fluctuates around a specific level. So we've answered those questions. Let's move on to more questions on these graphs. Write down the letter A, B, or C of the phase in the above graph, which illustrates a rapid growth, and we just did that. So when we looked at the rapid growth phase would be there, and here we see the population within a short period of time increasing rapidly. So the answer for that question would be B. So during B, which is the accelerated growth phase, the population doubles in a short span of time. The next question. Explain why the population size at C stayed constant. And this is a 3-mark question. Let's look at that graph, guys. Here we see at point C that the population remains constant. Remember that in the environment offers resistance. So that population would fluctuate around its carrying capacity. So we refer to that as the carrying capacity, and we also say that the environment offers resistance. Folks, apart from environmental resistance and carrying capacity, remember that as the population increases, space becomes, in an area, space becomes a problem. So there's competition for space, there's competition for resources, and hence you'll find that the population will not go beyond the carrying capacity because of environmental resistance, as well as competition for resources within that population. Let's go on to the next question. Okay. Give 2 reasons why the population growth at A was slow. Now, if we look at A, we called A the lag phase. Guys, in any population, the organisms are firstly acclimatizing to their environment, so they need time to acclimatize and adjust to the area. So population's growth would be much slower, the rate of growth would be very slow initially. The individuals establish themselves in that area, they establish their habitat, they get familiar with the environment, and then you got to remember that the individuals are younger, not many have reached the reproductive age, and hence you'll find that their reproductive rate is much lower. They're becoming sexually mature, and after a little while, after a period of time, they mature, and that is when there are more reproductive partners available, and that is when you would see the next phase of an accelerated growth phase. Guys, before we go on to the next question, let's go for a break. When we get back, we're going to do a data response question based on population ecology. So go out, go back, stretch, come back refreshed, and we look at more questions. See you after the break. So I hope you guys have been refreshed during the break. We're going to go on to the next question, and I said it is a data response question. Let's read through the question very quickly. Tensions and issues around mining at Mtunzini. Okay. Plans are in place for 2,800 hectares of forestry and farming land just outside the north coast town of Mtunzini in KwaZulu-Natal to be mined for minerals such as zircon, ilmenite, and rutile. These valuable minerals are used in everyday products from paint, pigment, toothpaste, titanium golf clubs. Tension is rising between some Mtunzini residents and mining firms Exxaro, KZN Sands over whether mining should take place there. One group of residents accuses Exxaro of being environmentally unfriendly. Another group of residents, such as the Amakosi and leaders from the tribal areas, support the project, saying that mining would have a positive spin-off for the community. This article was adapted from the Sunday Tribune paper 2011. Let's look at the first question. And again, this is a data response question, so we're going to look at answers in the context. Name the 3 different role players or stakeholders that were involved in the issue above. And as I was reading through, guys, you would have noticed that I highlighted these individuals. So we've got, let's see, who's this affecting? So we've got the Mtunzini residents. These are one group of individuals. The Exxaro, KZN Sands, so it'll be that mining company. Also, we've got the Amakosi and leaders from the tribal areas that are all affected by this project. So the 3, we've identified 4 individuals, so that's the residents, the mining firm Exxaro, Amakosi, and leaders from the tribal areas are all individuals that will be affected by this project. Let's look at the next question, guys. State 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages of mining activities in Mtunzini. And this is a 4-mark question, which simply means that we've got to write down advantages and we've got to look at disadvantages. Guys, with any mining project, there's always advantages and always disadvantages. We've got to critically look at the advantages and disadvantages. In this case, we've got to comment on both, and hence we've got to give those honest answers. So the advantages of mining in any community, well, one is that it will contribute to the development of infrastructure. It will contribute to the economy of that area. It will definitely lead to the creation of jobs, so individuals are employed. It will also mean that infrastructure would build in that area, the business would bloom, for the simple fact that it becomes a mining hub. And being an industry that will supply essential minerals, it could be a source of minerals that are much cheaper as compared to having to import them, and hence those could be some of the advantages. Some of the disadvantages could be that, firstly, any mining activity will affect the natural ecosystem. So the possible effects that it has on the biodiversity. Mtunzini is a wonderful area. It's a forest area, 2,800 hectares, and I'm sure if we allowed mining to happen there, lots of deforestation would happen. The possibilities of pollution. If you look at the possible disadvantages, could be, we're not too sure in terms of whether the value of property would decrease, because I'm sure that you're not going to live, you wouldn't want to live near an area that is a mining hub. The sound pollution, the noise pollution, dust, and hence these will considerably affect the value of housing in those areas. So you could look at the disadvantages from that angle. So let's move on to another set of questions. During this segment, we're going to look at interactions between different species, and we're going to answer some of these questions based on how resources are partitioned and how competition exists between individuals belonging to the same species or between individuals belonging to different species. So the concepts would be interspecific competition, intraspecific competition, and terms associated with around resource partitioning and resource exclusion principles. So let's use that terminology in these questions. Study the pictures and graph below showing the community interactions and answer the questions that follow. So as I stressed at the beginning, whenever you see a graph, whenever you see a picture, a diagram, try and establish what the diagram, what the picture, what the graph is trying to explain. So here we see different organisms, they're feeding off one tree, and we see a giraffe which is much taller, we see here a gemsbok, and probably here a duik at the bottom. And if you look at these organisms, they feed off one source or one resource, but they have established eating at different heights. So here in the next diagram we see, guys, we see competition between what looks like 2 individuals belonging to the same species, and these would be males that are competing probably for territory or for breeding pairs. And in the third graph, here we see a graph, and remember, read the heading. It shows changes in population density of 2 paramecium species in the same habitat over a period of time. Here we've got Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum, and we see that one population increases while the other population decreases. So when this population increases, when the population of aurelia increases, the population of caudatum decreases. Okay, so let's answer those questions based on this. Name the following. In A, the community interaction represented in A. When we look at this interaction, guys, we see we see here that these organisms are sharing resources. So we clearly see organisms sharing resources between them, and we refer to this as resource partitioning. So we would refer to that as resource partitioning, or they're occupying different spaces, or spatial partitioning. Okay, let's look at the next question. Name the following type of competition represented in B. When we looked at B, guys, we said that these individuals belong to the same species, So this would be competition that exists between individuals belong to the same species, and that would be intraspecific competition. And often there's a confusion between interspecific competition and intraspecific competition. And I often remind my learners to remember it this way. So we often have inter-school competitions, which is competition with one school and a different school. So if we think of the schools as different species, it's competition between different species, and hence we say interspecific competition. When there is competition within schools, within the school, within the different age groups, within the different houses, we refer to that as an intra within the school and intra-specific competition. So when there's when there's competition between individuals belonging to the same species, it is intra-specific competition, as we've seen in this example. Let's move on to question C. So name the following, the community interaction represented in C. When we look at C, we're going to quickly look at C, guys, again. And here we see where two species coexist in the same habitat over a period of time, where one survives and the other is eliminated. So what could this type of competition be? Where one eliminates the other, having shared the same resource. We call this competitive exclusion, or we can refer to it as interspecific competition. I just want to explain what competitive exclusion principle is. Competitive exclusion principle is when two species closely related compete for a similar resource, and one outcompetes the other and leads to the destruction of that species or decrease in their numbers. And here we clearly see, from this graph, we can clearly see that Paramecium aurelia outcompetes the Paramecium caudatum, and hence we see this as an example of a type of competition within where one excludes the other because of the resources available. So in the next set of questions, we're going to look at, and these are questions that are based on skills, so they apply to your learning outcomes number 1. So it's about, you will find that it could be a data response question, it could be about an investigation or an experiment that was conducted, and you'd need to respond to that. So you'd need to remember your variables, your control variables, suggestions how to improve an experiment. So you've got to critically analyze these using the skills that are needed in an experiment. So let's read through what these groups of individuals had carried out. So the apparatus below was set up to investigate the effect of two different environmental factors on the behavior of woodlice, which are small invertebrate animals. The usual habitat for woodlice is decaying vegetation. So they live under decaying vegetation. The apparatus consists of 4 flattened, interconnected, guys, these are interconnected covered dishes. 2 of these dishes were placed in dark and 2 were placed in light conditions. A moist paper was placed in one of the 2 dishes, in each dark and light containers. 10 woodlice, guys, were then placed in each of the 4 dishes and allowed to move freely between the dishes. The number of woodlice present in each of the dish after 15 minutes was shown in the diagram below. So let's look at the illustration that we have. Here we see a diagram showing us the apparatus that was used to investigate the 2 different environmental factors that we're looking at. So the 2 environmental factors that we're looking at is light and dark and moisture. So we're testing 2 variables simultaneously in this experiment. Here we see 4 dishes, petri dishes that have been covered. These are in dark and these are in a light area, and these are kept with moist paper in them, but they all are interconnected, which simply means that the woodlice could choose to move into any one of those areas based on their preferences. Let's move on to the questions based on this. According to the investigation, which condition did woodlice prefer? If we go back to that diagram and we look at this, guys, and we can clearly see here there were 36 present in the dark and moist paper. There were 2 only present in the dark and dry, and this would be 0 present in light and dry, and we had 2 woodlice present in light and moist. So the most number of woodlice were present in an area that was dark and moist. So they prefer dark and moist environments. Let's move on to the next question. Explain one way in which the validity of this investigation could be improved. Now this simply means, what can you suggest that would improve the results, that would improve the validity, how valid these results are? When we look at this experiment, guys, we can see that we tested two variables simultaneously. We tested for light and light and dark, and we tested for moisture and dry. So woodlice prefer a moist and a dark area. So we could have carried out an experiment where we tested moisture separately, and we could have tested the intensity of light on them. So one way would be to carry out an experiment where we test light and darkness separately as compared to testing moisture and a dry environment on them. A second improvement to this experiment would be that if we look at the setup for this experiment, guys, we see that we've placed discs in only 2 of these chambers, and I think that it would make it a fair experiment if we had placed dry disc in this, so that we ensure that we tested only one variable. Other methods of improving this experiment would be to increase the number of times the experiment is done, to allow sufficient time for the woodlice to move through freely. 15 minutes could have been sufficient. We're not too sure if woodlice move faster or slower, and hence if we increase the duration, it could have given them an opportunity to move further or fast, or move based on their preferences. Guys, we've come to the end of this session on population ecology. A tip from me would be to go through as many questions as possible, learn your terminology, create a list of all the terminology that's relevant to this section, and read through that before the exam. All the best for your exams, guys. We'll see you soon.